Hello, everyone. My name is Ian Turner, and I'm a PhD student in the Food Systems Prism Lab at the University of British Columbia under the supervision of Dr. Nathan Peltier. Today I'm going to be talking to you about animal welfare in sustainability decision making, including some methodological development we've done and what it means for the Canadian egg industry. I'd like to begin first with some context. As I'm sure many of us know, the Canadian egg industry is currently in a transitionary period, phasing out the use of conventional cage production systems. This complete transition to alternative systems is expected to be completed by 2036 and is in line with similar movements around the world, including some US states and all European Union member states. This then leaves a few difficult questions. Namely, how should farmers navigate this transition? And importantly, how can we as researchers help? As alluded to in Dr. Peltier's talk previously, and as you will see in the following talk from my colleague Vivek Arulnathan, the latter of these two questions is a key focus of the research we do in the PRISM lab. The way we aim to answer this question is by using a technique called life cycle assessment, or LCA for short. LCA is the foremost tool for environmental impact assessment today, and it's used to assess the cumulative impacts of a product throughout its life cycle, meaning it looks at the environmental impacts associated with every step along the supply chain, from raw material extraction to the end of life disposal and management. So to think about it visually, you may start with something like this, which represents all of the inputs and outputs to a conventional cage egg farm in Canada. Now, you could very easily do a farm level impact assessment, where you find the environmental impacts of burning different types of fuel and other things like that on the farm. What LCA does, though, is it goes further. LCA asks, well, what are the inputs to each of the farm inputs? So here you would start looking at the impacts of milling and transporting feed, or of producing pullets, for example. Then it will ask, what are the inputs to those inputs? And so on and so forth until you reach the end of the supply chain. Now, at this point, we've only gone 4 steps back from the original farm, but this picture could continue to expand substantially. So when you're performing an LCA of egg production, for example, the results represent the cumulative environmental impacts of everything that you see on the screen right now and beyond. Now, I'm sure many of you have heard of things like carbon footprints or water footprints, and LCA is quite similar to these kinds of analyses, with one important difference. LCA is a multi-criteria assessment methodology. A carbon footprint, for example, will only look at greenhouse gas emissions from entire supply chains, so it's a single criteria assessment methodology. LCA, on the other hand, will often include greenhouse gas emissions as one of the impacts assessed, but will also include things like emissions that contribute to water acidification, those that deplete the ozone layer, among many other environmental impacts. And importantly, LCA allows us to find instances in which there are trade-offs across different environmental impacts, where certain processes may perform well in one impact and poorly in another. It's this versatility and ability to investigate many different environmental impacts that has allowed LCA to become such a useful tool for sustainability investigation and decision support. LCA may be used to investigate possible renewable energy and waste valorization strategies, or questions around alternative feed formulations, as you will hear in some later talks. And the results generated can in turn provide decision support to farmers and policymakers by allowing them to make informed choices when it comes to sustainability. Sustainability, however, is a multifaceted concept, taking into account environmental, economic, and social components. So while a particular egg production system may fare well in the environmental facet of sustainability compared to others, it may face challenges in either of the other two components that need to be considered as well before making any sustainability policy decisions. In fact, to ensure net positive sustainability outcomes, we really need to be simultaneously taking into account the large number of contributors that can make or break the sustainability of a process. Luckily, methods have been developed within the LCA field to investigate social impacts using social LCA and economic impacts using a technique known as life cycle costing. Animal welfare, however, is a topic that has been largely absent from LCA until fairly recently. The first two attempts to integrate animal welfare into the LCA framework were published in 2018 and 2019. While these represent good first steps towards this goal, they do not cover a wide enough range of factors contributing to animal welfare, nor are they multi-criteria assessment methodologies, which you will remember is a hallmark of the LCA field. So, we set out to fill this research gap by developing a more comprehensive, multi-criteria animal welfare assessment methodology within the LCA framework for laying hens, ensuring that the methodology was in line with current animal welfare science. To do this, we reviewed recent animal welfare literature published between 2009 and 2019 to identify all the requisite components needed for an animal welfare impact assessment method. Importantly, data availability was taken into account during this process because it's one key area of divergence between LCA and animal welfare as scientific fields. LCA is performed using large sample sizes because we want to create models of industries as accurately as possible, while animal welfare studies are often done on a relatively smaller scale. What this means is that we had to make sure that the methodology we developed was able to be applied at the large scale needed for LCA while still being representative of the animal welfare science. In total, we ended up reviewing roughly 300 different sources to identify all of the different components needed, across which we noted 809 unique measures that were taken in animal welfare studies. These included egg quality measurements, molecular physiological measurements from blood samples, whole bird behavioral assessments, and many others that were all assessed for how commonly they were used in animal welfare research, as well as how well they could be integrated into the LCA framework. This review allowed us to finalize a methodology, only a very small portion of which is depicted here at the top for the sake of simplicity, as the complete picture is too large to fit on a slide. Overall, the method is composed of 3 impacts related to biological health, behavior, and affective state, as well as sub-impacts for each. It is in line with current animal welfare science and can be easily applied at a large scale. We were left, however, with perhaps the most important question. Does it provide results that are consistent with the animal welfare literature, including demonstrating the different trade-offs that are expected between different housing systems? And to answer that question, we had to test the method using a case study of the Canadian egg industry. And we found that the answer to that question is yes. On the left here, we see a pair of graphs representing the sub-impacts for biological health, namely mortality and morbidity or injury. Something I really want to make clear about these graphs is that the actual values don't matter, because the type of LCA methodology developed looks at relative performance levels or relative risk levels. Rather, what really matters is the differences in the bars within each graph. In each of these two graphs, a taller bar represents a worse outcome. And what we see is that, generally, cage-free systems perform worse with regards to biological health than their caged counterparts, which is a result that is in line with what is expected based on the animal welfare literature. Further, we also start to see interesting trade-offs between different impacts. For example, we see that the risk of mortality in organic systems on the top graph is relatively low, but the risk of morbidity or injury is the highest in organic systems looking at the bottom graph. So already we're starting to see trade-offs between different welfare impacts looking only at biological health. We can also use this methodology to look at the fulfillment of behavioral needs by each housing system, focusing on dust bathing, foraging, nesting, and perching behaviors. Unlike the graphs on the previous slide, a taller bar is better here, and we can clearly see that in this case, cage-free systems are the systems that perform better. And when we look at all three of these graphs together, we see a very distinct trade-off between the fulfillment of behavioral needs and the two biological health graphs. Specifically, we see that caged systems perform better than their alternative counterparts in biological health, indicated by the green squares, and worse in behavior, indicated by the red square. Importantly, this result is consistent with results from the animal welfare literature. There are also other graphs which further illustrate these trade-offs across affective state and other sub-impacts as well, indicating that this methodological development was a success and represents a significant step forward from the previous attempts to integrate animal welfare assessment into the LCA framework. So with this new information in mind, we can return again to the question that many egg industries are facing: how should egg production transition away from conventional cage production? By integrating animal welfare assessment into LCA, we're further expanding the LCA toolkit into a more holistic sustainability assessment tool, allowing policymakers and farmers to make informed decisions around how exactly to answer this question. This will allow for identification of the possible wide-ranging trade-offs between different contributions to sustainability, which must be considered to ensure net positive outcomes in sustainability decision-making. I'd like to conclude finally by touching on next steps in application of this methodology. In the near future, this methodology will be implemented alongside environmental assessment tools in the National Environmental Sustainability Tool, or NEST, as you'll hear about shortly. This will put all of this information in the hands of farmers so that they are able to make informed decisions around sustainability on their farms. And with that, I would like to thank the CPRC for this opportunity and to invite any questions about the work that anyone has.
I'm looking, there's no questions so far in the question and answer, but I've got one for you, because I really like that presentation, because it shows that sustainability or the environmental impact versus the welfare are not necessarily going together. And a lot of time you would hear activists or people who are really strongly opinionated try to bundle up all of that it has to be organic in order to become welfare friendly and so on. So my question to you is, how do you think the results from your studies is going to change a little bit the perception of various key players here?
Yeah, see, that is a very good question, because at the end of the day, within the LCA field, we are told that we're not allowed to provide any different kinds of weightings across any of the different impacts that we look at. And that's generally used as a guideline in environmental LCA, but it applies just as much to social LCA or economic life cycle costing, for example. And it really comes down to a personal value choice, essentially. And I think that's really the most important thing, is that I don't know if people will necessarily take what I've done and will draw wide-ranging conclusions and say something like, oh, obviously then the entire industry should be organic. Instead, by integrating it into the NEST system, people will be allowed to see, okay, this is where one system performs better than another. This is where that same system performs a little bit worse. And people are empowered to make their own decisions based on their own personal values.
All right, thank you. Great answer. And there is no magic answers when it comes to more on the social side. There are people that have opinions, and sometimes science doesn't necessarily fit the opinions. Here we've got a question from Danielle. Nice presentation, Ian. Do you think the the introducing of animal welfare into LCA is happening too late, as policy and decision making regarding layers in cage have already been developed?
Short answer, yes. Slightly longer answer, the work that was done by Laura Shearer and Craig Talentier is only 2 to 3 years old. And just recently, I believe in January, actually, UNEP updated their social LCA guidelines, in which they finally included a little section on animal welfare as a social impact, which, I mean, on one hand, it is a big win because UNEP is a very large regulatory body. So it's great to see that message coming from such a large group. However, there are issues with it. Namely, it includes it as ethical treatment of animals, which of course leads to the question, well, what is ethical? And that isn't necessarily in line with the current paradigm in animal welfare science. So, like I said, yes, I wish it had happened sooner. That being said, I think that there is definite progress and movement towards what I think can be a really important and a really great part of the LCA field in hopefully the next few years.
Great, thank you very much. And